Hi, this is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and I'd like to welcome you to the Week 2 lecture about the nature of mankind and the ongoing conflict between good and evil. And of course, these are two of the biggest topics that are the basis of literature and religion throughout history. And so the first thing we're going to look at briefly is the idea of, or the ideas of, religion and mythology, and that is exploring the conflict between good and evil since the beginning of recorded time. And as most of you are probably aware, the creation story in the Bible begins with a beautiful, perfect world created in 7 days, and only one thing is forbidden. And depending on the version that you recall, that one thing is not just an apple, but the tree of knowledge. And so the perfect world is lost when the devil or Satan or the snake tricks the first people into disobeying God's will. And there are many other creation stories and other traditions that describe how the world came into being, such as the Greek gods and goddesses, who were said to have descended from a race of supernatural giants known as the Titans. And so, what is the difference between good and evil? And of course, this is a lovely picture of what can only be a good and innocent baby. And according to our passage this week from Mencius, people are born good and then are corrupted by the world. And he wrote, in good years, young men are mostly fine. In bad years, they're mostly cruel and violent. So his idea was, among other ideas of his, that people are affected very much by their environment, and if a person is corrupted by the world, then they will no longer be good as they were when they were born. And so here we have an apple, which is symbolic and also a delicious piece of fruit. And what is the difference between good and evil? There are big choices, most of which we hopefully make correctly. But in the Bible, there was the big choice in which Cain killed his brother Abel because his brother had God's favor and that of his parents, and he became extremely envious and jealous. And then there are small choices or not so small choices, looking the other way when something unpleasant is happening to someone else, when perhaps we might have intervened, or to join in a conversation that could be hurtful to someone. So we have a little gossip going on instead of perhaps putting a stop to it or ignoring it, which was our first little possibility here, but to join in and actually add to the gossip. So we make those choices every day. Well, hopefully not the big ones. And also to think about this, are people born evil? Some authors throughout time and philosophers believe that people are born evil. And so is our natural state really bad? And Hun Tzu wrote that man's nature is evil. And this argument would appear to go against the grain of what we might have been taught about children and babies in that delightful child earlier in the presentation. And Tzu wrote that any man who follows his nature and indulges his emotions will inevitably become involved in wrangling and strife, will violate the forms and rules of society, and will end as a criminal. So if we give in too much to our natural impulses, to anger, or to eat too much, or to take what isn't ours, that we will violate the laws of society and the rules of society and become criminals. So that's a fairly pessimistic view of mankind. And then how could we possibly balance good against evil, liberty against order and safety? And so every nation or group of people or tribe throughout history has had to either make decisions or had those decisions imposed upon them of whether they were going to trade some of their freedom for security. As you know, in the United States, we give up our freedom to drive our cars at the highest possible speed so that we can all be reasonably safe when we drive on the highway. So we give up some of our freedom so that we can have a certain amount of security, we hope, or at least peace and somewhat civilized environments. And so John Locke, who is also one of our authors, he was one of the most important political theorists of his time, and his ideas were incorporated almost verbatim into the American Declaration of Independence. And so if you've never heard of John Locke, it might be worth looking at some of his work if you're interested in history and politics and how the United States came to be. And Locke gave a great deal of thought to how people accumulate knowledge, wisdom, and ideas. And as our reading assignment said this week, he asked, how comes the mind to be, or he said, how comes it to be furnished? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience. And so you'll note that if our quotation needs a little bit of clarification, we can put that in brackets, and those brackets tell us that there's been a mild substitution in the quote. So you're not going to substitute something that means something entirely different in your brackets, but this is the way you can document a quote that's had a little bit of a change. We put the actual nouns in instead of the pronouns here, and also right here we have left out part of our quote, and so we have the ellipsis to indicate that. So this is a little bit of documentation information here as well. And then one thing that we will think about in this class is how stories help us explore the battle between good and evil, among other things. And the ability to tell stories has given humanity the power to share knowledge, to celebrate the beauties of the world, and to caution against its dangers. And so if you'll note here, this is a picture that I took when I was at the St. Louis Public Library main branch. And I thought it was really fascinating that these books right here in the shelf had as their background this lovely church outside. So I thought that was a wonderful melding of maybe the secular, worldly literature along with the church in the background. And then here is a lovely picture that I took at the St. Louis Cathedral in the Central West End, and just to show how that cathedral looks upward and toward heaven, and many of our stories that we read and know of do that too. And so the written word, which of course these are visual messages here, but the written word from ancient Sumerian clay cuneiform tablets full of accounting records, which are the first known written work. So it's very interesting that that is actually not stories but accounting records, to Egyptian hieroglyphics in the pharaoh's tombs, to the multitude of ancient scrolls at the library at Alexandria, which unfortunately burned down, to the ebook on your Kindle, has given humanity ways to communicate with contemporaries and with people who have yet to be born. And so we're going to continue the conversation, and we're going to think about defining humanity through stories, such as Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, in which a man is trapped by his fate, but also kind of tries to avoid it and yet brings it about. It's a very interesting story, and audiences may have found the downfall of rich and powerful heroes like Oedipus, who became a king and then found that everything that he had in his life was built upon a lie and was all a disaster. And so those heroes fell through their pride and carelessness, and audiences may have found that extremely enjoyable, as we might now when we hear about celebrities who get in trouble or have a very ugly mug shot in the newspaper. And then also during medieval times, the morality play Everyman was another example. In that play, a regular guy, just named Everyman, found himself face to face with death and judgment of the way he lived, and almost everyone abandoned him when he needed them the most. So it's a very interesting story, and it's been around a really long time, at least 1,000 years, and it's still valid in many ways today. And of course, one of the greatest stories in the English language is the story of King Arthur And so that's also a story of good versus evil, and we don't even really know if Arthur was a real person. And there are things in his story that made him not always a good person, but also a victim of other people's mistakes and his own, of course. And then we're going to join the conversation with paper one. And so paper one is going to be an analysis of an international film, basically a film not made in the United States, and a relationship of that film to one of our reading assignments in this class in the first 3 weeks. So films to consider are listed here. I also have a list of 100 of the best, or at least according to IMDb, Internet Movie Database, of the 100 best movies not made in the United States, which is where I got some of the films on my film to consider list. And of course, one of them is also Harry Potter, so I just put the image there. And so think about which film you would like to write about, or maybe you have another international film you'd consider. So please let me know if it's not on the list what you'd like to write about. And as we go forward into week 2, thinking again about, is humanity inherently good or evil? What do you think?